I'll never forget that morning. The hotel lobby smelled like polished wood and cheap perfume. White light streamed in through glass so clean it looked like no one had ever touched it. I was standing there, hands gripping my suitcase, still buzzing with the excitement of a father eager to see his son smile. But instead of a smile, I got a sentence as cold as steel. Dad will sleep in the staff room. If he doesn't like it, he can go back. No one even looked up at me. My son said it like he was giving an order to a stranger. The boy I taught to walk, the one I'd stayed up all night with when he had a fever, was now pointing toward the back of the hotel where the employees stayed. That line echoed in my head, over and over, like metal hitting stone. I didn't answer. There are some kinds of pain that words just make smaller. I looked at him for a long time and then gave a little nod, as if it all made perfect sense. The boy I once carried on my shoulders had become a stranger, and I was just an old man with a suitcase and a foolish dream of a reunion trip. While an employee guided me down the back hallway, I heard my family's laughter coming from the bar. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and smug, saying something about my dad's ocean view room, referring to her own father. I turned my head, trying to be subtle, and saw my daughter-in-law's father leaning back in a chair, laughing hard, clapping my son on the shoulder, like they were the real father and son. That simple image squeezed my chest like someone was wringing it out. My room was at the end of the hall, near the linen closet. The paint on the wooden door was peeling, and the air was thick with the smell of bleach and dampness. I opened the door, put my suitcase on the floor, and looked around. The room was narrow, with a single weak yellow light bulb and a window that looked out onto a concrete wall. I hung my coat on a hook and put the small picture frame with my wife's photo on the table. She was smiling in the picture, with a look so tender it was like she was saying, "Don't be sad, Michael." I sat on the bed, my hands trembling from exhaustion and the emptiness growing inside me. Outside was the ocean, the dream I had once wanted to give my whole family. I had worked almost 40 years to be able to bring them here, to see my grandkids play, to hear my sons laugh like in the old days. I thought a week together would be enough to heal the cracks in the family, but it turned out I was the extra piece in the very story I had tried to build. I poured myself a glass of water. My hands still had the calluses from my years as a Votech teacher, hands that had held hammers, fixed furniture, hands that had done everything to keep our house standing. Now, those hands only knew how to grip each other to keep from shaking. I closed my eyes, trying to hear the waves. Somewhere between the smell of dampness and the hum of the air conditioning, I heard my wife's words again from before she passed. "Michael, if our son ever turns his back on you, don't be angry. Let him find the light on his own." I exhaled slowly. Maybe that was the path I had to follow. No yelling, no begging, just silence. Silence to wait for the day they'd realize who was the one who kept the lights on in this house for a whole lifetime. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. The first night of the trip I once called the family vacation started with the dry rattle of the old air conditioner. My room was so small I could touch both walls just by stretching out my arms. The smell of mildew mixed with cleaning supplies got caught in my throat, making me cough quietly. Outside, the sound of waves breaking on the shore and the laughter of guests at dinner sounded like they were from another world, a bright, distant world with no place for me. I took off my worn-out leather shoes and placed them neatly under the bed. On the wall hung a fogged-up mirror that reflected a face I didn't even recognize. Sunken eyes, gray hair. But the look in them was the same, the look of someone who once believed that sacrifice was the only language of love. I flicked on the table lamp with a soft click and took a small wooden box from my suitcase. Inside were some old photos, me, my wife, and the boy, back when he'd still hug me around the neck with a toothless grin and bright eyes. I remember so clearly the day he first yelled, "Dad!" I thought that love would never fade. And yet now, in the middle of a 5-star hotel, that same son was treating me like an old object that needed to be kept out of sight. I didn't feel anger, just cold. A cold that wasn't coming from the ocean breeze, but from inside. I opened the window, if you could even call that little slot a window, to get some air, but all I saw was a gray concrete wall stained with salt. The dim light hitting the wall seemed trapped, unable to escape. I realized I was the same. On the table, the picture frame of my wife reflected the weak yellow light. I ran my hand over her face in the photo and whispered, "Elizabeth, if you were here, you'd know what to say. All I know how to do is be quiet." In my memory, her voice sounded clear. "Michael, sometimes people don't need words. They need a mirror." I nodded slightly. Maybe I had to be that mirror, even if no one wanted to look at it. I lay down on the narrow bed. The mattress was hard as a board, and the smell of cheap soap was giving me a headache. I closed my eyes trying to sleep, but my head was filled with the sound of my son's laughter and the clinking of glasses. I imagined them talking about me, the old, difficult, meddling father. I tried to push the thought away, but I couldn't. Some words, no matter how small, cut deep as a knife. Around midnight, a draft slipped under the door. I sat up and poured a glass of water. The faint moonlight was creeping over the top of the gray wall, drawing a small sliver of light on the floor. I stared at it for a long time. In that moment, I understood that loneliness has a shape, and it was sitting right next to me, silent and patient. I said quietly, as if talking to myself, "If this is how they're going to learn the value of a father, fine, I'll wait." Then I turned off the light, leaving the room in a thin darkness. The ocean waves kept breaking, steady as ever. Maybe only the sea knew how to listen anymore. The first morning of the vacation I thought would bring the family together started with the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. I opened my door and saw my son, David, walk by with his wife, Jessica, and their 2 kids. He was holding a cup of coffee and was talking and laughing as if nothing was wrong. When our eyes met, he just nodded briefly, the way you'd nod at a distant acquaintance. I returned the gesture, but inside, I felt a void so big that not even anger could fill it. The main hotel restaurant was flooded with sunlight. The tables were lined up perfectly, and the smell of coffee and hot butter reminded me of weekends long ago when Elizabeth was alive. She always made fried eggs for David and me, and she'd laugh. "You two eat like construction workers." Now, I was still that construction worker. Only the building had collapsed. I chose a small table in the corner of the staff-designated area because there was no room in the main section. A young waitress saw me and asked quietly, "What can I get you, sir?" Her voice was soft and respectful, so different from the sharp voices I'd gotten used to in the last 2 days. "Black coffee, thank you, hun." When she put the cup on the table, I said quietly, "Thanks for calling me sir. It's been a long time since anyone spoke to me with that kind of respect." She smiled without answering. That smile, simple but warm, made me feel like I still existed in this world. Through the large window, I saw David's whole family sitting outside. Jessica, in a white dress, was taking pictures for her social media. Her father, Richard, was sitting comfortably next to her, signaling to a waiter to change the type of wine. I saw David laugh, that laugh I used to be so proud of because it sounded like mine, and that now sounded like the edge of a razor scraping my soul. My oldest granddaughter, Chloe, saw me first. The little girl waved her hand and yelled with pure innocence, "Grandpa, why are you sitting all alone?" Jessica quickly pulled her hand down, a forced smile on her face. "Let Grandpa rest, honey. He's tired." I heard it, as clearly as if she'd said it right next to my ear. Tired. That word was like a label stuck to my forehead, useless, outdated, no longer needed. I lowered my head and took a sip of coffee. It was bitter all the way down, but at least that taste was real. In the midst of the laughter and the camera flashes, I felt like a shadow lost in a picture I hadn't been invited to. Suddenly, I thought that maybe every family has one person who just gets forgotten, not because of any mistake, but because everyone else is too busy living in a hurry. I remembered something Elizabeth used to say. There are 2 kinds of loneliness, Michael. One is when people leave you. The other is when they're still right there, but they're looking right through you. Now I understood. I was living the second kind. I looked around and saw the employees clearing tables nod at me. I unconsciously nodded back, as if thanking these strangers for treating me like a human being. Inside me, a thought, as painful as it was clear, began to form. If they don't see me, then I'll make them see me. Not with yelling, but with silence. I finished my coffee and stood up slowly. Outside, the sun was streaming through the glass, hitting me right in the eyes, hot but pure. I thought I'd put up with enough cold. From that moment on, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't anger. It was the determination of a father who wanted to teach one last lesson about respect. The second night passed in a strange silence. The small room seemed to swallow my breath. Outside, the sea wind was blowing hard, hitting the glass and making it vibrate softly, like someone sighing. I stared at the ceiling. The dull, yellowish light stained the wall. In my mind, the images from the morning replayed. Jessica's superficial smile, Richard's cold handshake, David's evasive stare. It all spun around like a wheel stuck in the sand, squeaking endlessly. I fell asleep when the clock showed almost midnight, taking my exhaustion and the smell of salt still in my hair with me. In my dream, I was standing on a white sand beach. The sea was strangely calm. There was no wind, just the soft beat of my heart, like a small drum. Then, from the horizon, a figure approached. It was her, Elizabeth, wearing that light blue dress I always loved. Her hair waved gently, like on those afternoons in our youth, back when we taught together at the local school. I called her name quietly. "Elizabeth?" She smiled without saying anything, and simply placed her warm hand on my chest. The feeling was so real, I thought I had died. Her voice echoed after, soft as a whisper. "Michael, don't let your heart turn to stone. A person can get old, they can be poor, but if their heart hardens, they lose everything." I lowered my head, almost about to cry. "You saw all of it, didn't you? The humiliation, the silence I've had to swallow day after day." Elizabeth nodded. "We can't stop others from forgetting gratitude, but we can remind them with our dignity. Don't seek revenge. Just let them see themselves in the mirror they turned their back on." I stayed quiet. It had been so long since I'd heard her voice, so soft but so firm, like the time I wanted to quit my job because of the pressure, and she told me, "Michael, there are lessons only an old teacher can give." Now, I knew she was reminding me of that one more time. The wind picked up, swirling the fine sand around my feet. Elizabeth took a step back, still smiling. "Your son still has a piece of you in his heart. It's just covered up by the noise of life. When he's silent, he'll hear it. But first, you have to make him be silent." Before I could ask how, everything faded. All that was left was the echo of her voice in the wind. "Don't yell, Michael. The silence of a person who's been hurt is the loudest sound other people can hear." I woke up with a jolt. Moonlight was slipping through the crack in the door, drawing a line of light as thin as a thread on the pillow. A cold sweat was running down my back. I sat up, breathing deeply. In that suffocating room, I suddenly felt like someone was with me. It wasn't loneliness, it was Elizabeth, or at least the tender part of her that lived in me. I picked up the picture frame and held it to my chest. "You were right. Elizabeth, sometimes people only learn when they hit rock bottom in shame. I won't let resentment control me, but I will make them see me, not with yelling, but with a silence that forces them to look at themselves." Outside, the sea continued to murmur, but this time, the sound of the waves no longer seemed like a lament, but a promise that the next morning I would start over, not to win back affection, but to win back dignity. The next morning, the sun flooded the large windows of the hotel restaurant. The aroma of roasted coffee mixed with soft background music, creating a cheerful atmosphere where I felt strangely out of place. I sat at a table near the door, far from the large table where David's family was having breakfast with Jessica's. From my spot, I could see every detail: Jessica's white dress, Richard's fake smile, and the way my son tilted his head to listen to them, as if that was his real family. I tried not to look, but my eyes felt drawn to them. A hotel photographer was taking pictures of the guests. When he got to their table, Jessica stood up gracefully and pulled Richard and the kids closer. She said in a cheerful voice, "We should get a picture to remember this vacation." The group gathered together, smiling. I remained still, the cup of coffee in my hand slowly going cold. Then, my little granddaughter Chloe looked up, looked around, and said in a clear voice, "Grandpa, aren't you coming in the picture?" In that instant, everything stopped for a second. I saw Jessica frown, her hand landing on the girl's shoulder, and her voice, though soft, was cold. "Grandpa is tired, honey. Let him rest. Don't bother him." The photographer hesitated, looking at me. I nodded slightly, smiled, and waved for him to continue. The flash went off. I wasn't in that picture, but I was the one who had paid for every single smile being captured. I left the table and went out to the terrace. The wind brought the smell of salt and the rhythmic sound of the waves. The first rays of sun warmed my skin gently, but inside I felt cold. I wondered, since when does a father's love become a debt that makes a son feel burdened? Since when does a father have to buy his place in the family with hotel bills? Under the shade of a palm tree, I saw an elderly couple walking hand in hand. They were talking quietly. They shared a piece of bread and looked at each other with a warmth that seemed to say only the two of them existed in the world. I watched them, and suddenly I remembered Elizabeth. She used to say, "Michael, if one day our son forgets his roots, don't be angry with him. Show him the way with how you live, not with your words." I smiled sadly. Maybe it was time to do that. Around noon, I ran into Chloe in the hallway. The little girl ran to hug my legs and whispered, "Grandpa, I want to have breakfast with you tomorrow." I gently stroked her head and replied, "Of course, sweetheart. But don't tell your mom, okay?" She giggled. Her eyes sparkled like sunlight through water. In that moment, I felt like I was still seen, even if only through the eyes of a child. When she ran off, I turned and looked at myself in the lobby mirror. The reflection showed an old man, a bit stooped, but his gaze was different. It was no longer the look of someone just enduring. I understood that pain only weakens people if they lower their heads, and for me, it was time to stand up straight, even if just for myself. In the afternoon, while David's family got ready for a walk on the beach, I sat quietly on the back terrace of the hotel, where the employees took their breaks. A young waiter offered me another cup of coffee. I accepted, smiling. In the dim light, I said, as if to myself, "Sometimes you don't need to be in the picture to be the one holding it up." And for the first time since I arrived, I felt a real calm. A dangerous, silent, but very clear calm, like the sea before a storm. That afternoon, the hotel was buzzing with the sound of music and kids running down the halls. In the distance, I heard David's laugh mixed in with the crowd. I didn't want to watch anymore, so I headed to the little pier where a few fishermen were still selling fresh fish to tourists. The wind tasted like salt and messed up my gray hair. I sat on an old wooden bench and ordered a lemonade. At the next table, a young couple was arguing quietly, but just loud enough for me to hear every word. "I told you, you're spending too much," the girl complained. "It's what your dad wants. I don't dare contradict him," the man replied, annoyed. "My father deserves to be treated like this. He has a status. Not just anyone gets to sit at a table with him." "And what about your father? He only has you, but you've never invited him." I turned my head discreetly. The girl went quiet and left, leaving the man sitting there, staring into his glass of beer. The phrase, "And what about your father?" echoed in my head, as if that young man was speaking for me. I looked out at the sea. The afternoon sun cast a golden sheen on every wave. I thought about Elizabeth, about the years I worked without rest to raise my son, the extra classes, the late nights grading papers, the mornings eating cold bread to save money to buy him shoes. All of it, the love, the sacrifice, the faith, was now just a one-sided memory. I remembered when David was little. Every time it stormed, he was afraid of the thunder and would run to hide behind me. I used to tell him, "Don't be afraid, son. As long as I'm here, nothing will hurt you." The boy would look up and smile innocently. Now, he was the one making me feel like the smallest, weakest man in the world. I lowered my head, playing with the rim of the glass. Across the way, the young couple sat back down together, in silence, no longer arguing. Suddenly, I realized that all conflicts start the same way: pride and ingratitude. People want to be recognized, they want others to submit, and when they get it, they think they've won. But in reality, they're losing something inside themselves. A strong gust of wind blew. All at once, I heard Elizabeth's voice in my head. If they don't learn with words, let life teach them with consequences. I looked up toward the hotel in the distance. There, David, Jessica, and Richard were sitting under an umbrella, laughing among themselves. They didn't know that even the air they were breathing, that atmosphere of luxury, had been bought with my sweat. Suddenly, I felt my heart calm down. It wasn't anger anymore, but a cold clarity. I stood up, paid, and walked slowly back to the hotel. Each step sounded like a clock ticking in my head. Something was waking up in me. It wasn't a desire for revenge. It was a lesson I needed to teach again, not with screams, not with tears, but with the calculated silence of someone who was a teacher. As I passed through the lobby, I saw David talking with his father-in-law. They were laughing, clinking their glasses in a toast. Jessica looked at me, her eyes indifferent. But this time, I didn't lower my head to avoid her gaze. I just looked at her steadily and smiled, just slightly, a smile that unsettled her. That night, I sat alone on the small balcony of the staff area, listening to the waves crash against the rocks. The wind was damp and tasted like salt, cold but pleasant. I closed my eyes and said quietly, "Thank you for forgetting me, David. Because of it, I remembered who I am." High above, the moon was blurred by the sea mist. Its light was faint, but it was enough to see the path ahead of me clearly, the path I was about to take to teach my own son his final lesson. The next morning, the rain had just stopped. The air was incredibly clear and fresh. I walked down the long hallway. The smell of damp wood mixed with floor wax. The employees in their blue uniforms greeted me with kind smiles. No one knew who I was, much less that I was the person who had paid for the entire floor of luxury rooms where my family was staying. How strange. Sometimes it's the strangers who make you feel more seen than your own relatives. I went to the front desk to ask about the bill, simply because I wanted to understand where I stood in all this. The man behind the counter looked older, with gray hair, a kind face, and a firm voice. His name tag read, Robert Miller, Manager. "Good morning, sir," he said with a sincere smile. "Good morning. I just wanted to ask," I paused, hesitating, "about the payments." Robert tilted his head, looking at me like an old friend. Mr. Evans, right? You're the one who booked the entire stay for your family. I still remember your name. Few people are as detailed as you. All the main expenses were paid in advance, except for the small additional charges." I nodded, grateful. As I was about to leave, he added, "I've been working here for over 20 years, and believe me, few people do what you do. Most people only think of themselves. It's admirable that there are still fathers who care so much for their children." Those simple words made a lump form in my throat. A stranger, just by reading a few lines in a file, understood what my whole family was pretending not to see. I smiled and replied quietly, "There are some things you don't do to be remembered, but because if you didn't do them, your conscience wouldn't let you sleep." Robert nodded. "I understand. Your generation always lived that way." We talked a little more. He told me he'd been a teacher before becoming a hotel manager. "Teaching people decency and managing a hotel aren't so different," he said, laughing. "Both require patience and respect." Hearing that, I laughed, a light laugh I hadn't had in a long time. Before I left the counter, he looked around and said in a low voice, "If you need anything, don't hesitate to tell me. At our age, respect is a rare thing, and I'd hate to see someone like you be disrespected." I just nodded, answering with my eyes. Robert's words were like a stone tossed into the calm water of my soul, creating soft ripples. Maybe he didn't know it, but with just those few words, he had opened a door leading to an idea I never thought I'd have the strength to follow through on. In the afternoon, I ran into Robert again in the restaurant. He passed by my table and put a hand on my shoulder. "The coffee here is a bit bitter, but don't worry. I told them to add a little extra sugar for you. Good people deserve to be treated kindly, even if it's just in a cup of coffee." I looked at him, feeling a warmth in my chest. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel like the forgotten old man, but like a person with value. and as the sun streamed through the glass, lighting up the table, I suddenly understood that life always sends you kind people right when you think the world has turned its back on you. That night, I wrote a few lines in my small notebook. Today, a stranger reminded me that respect isn't dead. It just needs someone brave enough to preserve it. Maybe that kindness is the seed of the lesson I'm about to plant. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. The sea was still roaring, and in the sound of the waves, I thought I heard Elizabeth's voice. You see, Michael? When one door closes, kindness always finds a way. That night, the wind was blowing in from the sea, bringing a thick humidity and a strong smell of salt. I sat in the small room, listening to the waves as if they were the slow heartbeat of the world. On the table, the cup of coffee Robert had sent me was still steaming slightly. I hadn't drunk it. I just looked at it, as if the answer to everything was hidden in that thin column of steam. I opened my notebook and reread the lines I had written that afternoon. The handwriting was slanted, a little shaky but clear. You only really get old when you stop wanting to understand. I read that sentence over and over. Maybe I had never understood my son in the right way. I had taught him to work hard, to be honest, but I never taught him how to hold on to gratitude in an age where everything is measured in money. I remembered Elizabeth's words in my dream. When he's silent, he'll hear it. But for him to be silent, I had to be the first one to know how to be quiet. Not a silence out of fear, but a silence out of understanding. I stood up and opened the heavy wooden door. The wind blew in, cold, but it cleared my mind. I started walking down the long hallway, past the staff rooms, and then I took the path that led to the back of the hotel. There, dim lights lit the wet stone floor. And in the distance, you could see the path that led to the luxury area, where David and his family were sleeping. I didn't have a specific purpose. I just wanted to walk, to hear the sound of my own footsteps. There was something in that rhythm, firm, constant, that reminded me of my teaching days. Every time a student made a mistake, I wouldn't scold them. I would just look at them, and it was that silence that made them realize their error. When I stopped in front of the staircase that went up to the top floor, Sam, the young employee I had met a few days earlier, passed by. He was pushing a cart of white linens, and when he saw me, he stopped and smiled. "Sir, this is a technical area. Do you need help?" "No, thank you, son. I'm just taking a walk. Can't sleep." "Not many people are out at this hour, but if you want, I can show you a shortcut to the beach. It's really nice." I nodded. "Show me, but just point the way. Don't talk much. I'd rather listen to the wind." He smiled slightly. We walked down a narrow hallway, with safety maps hanging on the walls and small doors leading to storage and electrical rooms. I memorized every detail unconsciously. I had no plan, just a feeling that these things, sooner or later, would be useful. The last door opened, and in front of me was the beach at night. The sky was a deep black. Waves with white crests broke on the shore, and the moonlight shattered on the water's surface. I took a deep breath. The salty sea air tasted real, like life. "It's beautiful, isn't it, sir?" Sam said. "Beautiful," I replied in a low voice. "But real beauty isn't in what you see, but in what you understand when you see it." He fell silent. Then he said goodbye and left. I was alone. Under the moonlight, I felt I was no longer the forgotten old man, but someone waking up from a long dream. I didn't know what my next plan would be, but I was sure that from that moment on, I wouldn't let others define my value. I went back to my room, closed the door, and poured myself the cup of coffee from Robert. Its bitter taste wasn't so hard to swallow anymore. I smiled slightly and wrote something else in my notebook. When you stop expecting to be loved, that's when you start to really understand what love is. Then I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the sea was still roaring, but inside me, there was an unusual silence. The silence of someone who is about to do something they had never dared to do in their entire life, live for himself, and teach one final lesson with his own awakening. The next morning, the sky was so clear it looked like the whole world had just been washed. I got up early and went out to the back terrace of the hotel, where the employees usually had coffee before starting work. The hum of the coffee machine and the smell of toast filled the small space. There were no white tablecloths or crystal glasses here, just sincere laughter and honest looks. The young waiter, Sam, saw me and waved. "Mr. Evans, come sit with us. The morning coffee here is better than in the restaurant." I smiled and sat down in a plastic chair. A young girl, her hair pulled back and her hands still flurry, brought me a roll. "Want to try the sweetbread we make?" "If you're recommending it, how could I say no?" The group laughed. A small joy, but enough to warm the cold morning. I looked around at them, people who worked in silence, serving others all day, but who still held on to their joy. No one was showing off, no one was giving orders. They called each other by their names, shared their food, and joked around like a real family. I suddenly thought, this is the image of the family I always dreamed of. No luxuries, just kindness and mutual respect. The girl who brought me the bread, named Emily, asked me, "Did you come on vacation with your family?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but I think I've forgotten what it means to rest." The group went quiet for a moment. Sam looked at me with understanding. "Sometimes people only value someone when they lose them, sir. But if you're still here, it means no one has completely lost you." I looked at him and smiled slightly. "You talk like you've lived 100 years. You don't need to live long to understand the simple things, sir. At my house, my parents argue all the time, but every night they sit down at the table together. They say, family doesn't need to be perfect, just patient." That sentence left me speechless. I realized that patience was what I had lost. I had lived my whole life for my son, but maybe I never had the patience to watch him stray without judging him. I took a sip of coffee. Its taste was a mix of bitter and sweet, simple and real. A strange feeling washed over me, like a small ray of light breaking through a dense cloud. As I was leaving, Sam called out, "Sir, there's a party on the hotel beach tonight. Don't forget to go. You don't need anyone to go with you. Someone like you is welcome anywhere." I nodded and thanked him. On my way back, I saw David's family taking pictures by the pool area. Jessica was smiling brightly, Richard was adjusting his son-in-law's tie, and David was staring at his phone, paying no attention to anyone. I stopped for a moment, watching the scene through the thick glass of the lobby. Inside, there was fake laughter. Outside, simple people who had just shared a real cup of coffee with me. Two worlds, coexisting, separated only by a layer of glass. And me, standing in the middle. I suddenly understood that what makes people poor isn't a lack of money, but a lack of gratitude. I kept walking, my heart lighter. Maybe for the first time since I arrived at this place, I no longer felt lost. I was still alone, but no longer helpless. And in that new serenity, an idea began to take shape with clarity. The lesson I would give my family. Not to hurt them, but so they could learn to see, just as I had just been seen that morning through the smiles of people who owed me nothing. That afternoon, the sea was calm. The sunset stained the water's surface red and tinted the hotel walls a pale honey color. From the balcony of the staff area, I looked out over the courtyard, where David's family was getting ready for the night's party. Jessica, in a blue silk dress, was smiling radiantly next to her father. Richard, with his air of self-importance, was ordering the waiters to bring wine to the table, and David, the son who was once the pride of my life, was now just the shadow of another man. I sighed, but this time it wasn't from pain. There was a strange calm in me, the calm of someone who has passed the breaking point of suffering. I put on a white shirt I had ironed, buttoning it slowly, and looked at myself in the mirror. The mirror reflected a wrinkled face, but the look in those eyes was no longer dull. The party started as a live band began to play some soft jazz through the courtyard. Yellow lights, red wine, the laughter of guests mixing with the distant sound of the waves. I walked into the middle of the crowd. No one noticed. People don't see who they don't want to see. I chose a table at the edge where I could watch everything without being noticed. Robert, the manager, saw me from a distance and nodded discreetly. I returned the gesture with a small smile. We didn't need to talk. That look was enough. A moment later, we heard the clinking of glasses. David stood up, raised his glass, and said in a strong, confident voice, "I want to make a toast to family and to my father-in-law, the man who taught me what success is. Applause sounded. Richard smiled, proud. I pressed my lips together, a faint smile on my face. A father who teaches his son success with money, while I had taught him with character, and he had chosen the easier lesson. Jessica chimed in with a sweet voice, "And also for this wonderful vacation. Thanks to David, we get to enjoy all of this." The table applauded again. I heard it all, every word, like a knife. But this time, I didn't lower my head. I simply looked at my son calmly. When my gaze met his, David paused for an instant. For a second, something in that look made him uncomfortable. I put my glass on the table and said, just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe I should make a toast too." The atmosphere around me slowed down. Everyone turned. I stood up calmly. To family, of course, but mostly to those who know how to look someone in the eye without looking down on them. The wind blew. There was a second of absolute silence. Then, someone tried to force a laugh and clapped weakly. I paid no attention. I just looked at David, and for the first time on the whole trip, he didn't dare look me in the eye. I sat down and took a sip of wine. Robert passed by my side, pretending to ask guests if everything was all right, and whispered, "Everything's ready, Mr. Evans, just as you asked." I nodded slightly without answering. The party continued, but it wasn't as cheerful anymore. Jessica was forcing her smile, Richard was drinking faster, and David sat still, drumming his fingers on his glass. His gaze kept drifting over to me. He sensed something was changing, but he didn't know what it was yet. When the party was about to end, he stood up, trying to recapture the mood. "Dad, I hope you're in a better mood tomorrow. We'll take a walk on the beach together, okay?" I smiled, my voice as light as the wind. "Yes, tomorrow. It will be a day we all remember forever." I left the table before they could answer. The lights cast my long shadow on the damp sand. Behind me, the music was still playing. But in my heart, another melody had begun. The melody of an awakening, of a father who understood that sometimes silence is the most powerful answer. That night, I didn't go back to my room right away. I walked down the hall where the yellow lights projected on the walls. I thought about Robert, about Elizabeth, and about myself. And then I smiled. Tomorrow there would be no anger, no tears, only the truth. And the truth, sometimes, is the quietest storm. I returned to my small room just as the clock struck 11. The constant sound of the waves outside was like the long, slow breath of the sea. I turned on the small table lamp. Its yellow light cast a warm, lonely feeling on the wall. The room was silent. The only sound was the scratching of my pen on paper. On the table, I had prepared 3 white envelopes. Each envelope was a piece of a life, a corner of memory I had poured into it. One for David, one for Jessica, and one for Richard. Next to them, a stack of invoices, reservation agreements, payment receipts, all in my name. Michael Evans, primary reservation holder. I started with the letter to my son. I wrote the first line very slowly. "Son, I'm not writing this to shame you, but to remind you of who you are." I told him about the early years when his mother was still alive. The afternoons when Elizabeth would cook soup, I'd help him with his homework, and the house would be filled with laughter. I also told him about the hard days when I had to teach 3 extra classes a day to pay for his college tuition. The nights grading papers while listening to my wife's cough, and how we kept believing that this path would lead him to a better place. I stopped writing for a moment and looked at Elizabeth's picture frame. "You didn't betray me with your words, David," I continued writing. "You betrayed me with forgetting. You only truly lose your father when you stop seeing him as a person and start seeing him as a burden." As I folded that letter, I felt a heaviness in my heart, but a strange serenity washed over me. Next, I wrote to Jessica. I didn't blame her. I just wrote something brief, like a teacher correcting a student's poor lesson. "You've taught your husband how to hold his head high in front of the world, but you forgot to teach him how to bow his head to love. Remember, power doesn't hold a home together. Only respect can do that." I sealed that letter, feeling a little lighter. Finally, I wrote to Richard, the arrogant man who saw himself as a role model for the new generation. Dear Sir, perhaps this old man doesn't have the status to teach anyone anything. But please remember, a person's true value isn't in the wine they drink, but in how they make others feel after they've left the table. The 3 letters were lined up in front of me. I placed a small stone on each envelope, one I had picked up from the beach that afternoon. Elizabeth used to say, "Stones are the sea's memories, round, hard, and they never break." I looked in the mirror and saw my reflection, tired, but no longer weak. I understood that these lines weren't just a message, they were the final border between suffering and freedom. Outside the window, the wind blew, gently rattling the frame. I closed my notebook and carefully put the 3 envelopes in my briefcase. Then I took another small piece of paper and wrote for myself. Tomorrow, I'm not looking for justice. I'm just reclaiming my dignity. I folded the paper and tucked it into my shirt pocket. Then I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Between the crashing of the waves, I thought I heard Elizabeth's voice in a whisper. "I'm proud of you, Michael. You're not getting revenge. You're teaching them." I smiled and closed my eyes. Sleep took a long time to come, but it was peaceful. Outside, the sea continued to breathe, as if promising to carry those letters to their destination. And I knew that the next morning, when the sun rose, the day of the final lesson would begin. I couldn't sleep much. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up in a thick darkness. Outside, the sea was still murmuring, as if telling old stories. I sat up, put on a jacket, and turned on the table lamp. The dim light lit up the 3 white envelopes on the table. They lay there, motionless, but they contained an entire life. Mine, David's, the years when I believed love was enough to close any distance. I took another sheet of paper and started writing. Not for anyone, but for myself, like someone writing a confession. I, Michael Evans, have lived for more than 70 years, and in all that time, I never learned to say, "That's enough." I kept giving, enduring, believing that love would make people understand. But sometimes, blind sacrifice is what makes others forget your true value. I stopped. The ink smudged on the page. Memories appeared like fragments of an old film. Me, 30 years younger, arguing with my father on the porch of our house. He was a farmer with leathery skin and calloused hands. That day, I told him not to hold on to the farm anymore, that I wanted to go to the city to teach. He just looked at me and said quietly, "Go on, son. Just don't forget your roots." And I left, with the pride of youth and the feeling that I was moving up. When he died, I didn't make it in time. I just got a short letter from my mother. "Your father waited until the very last moment, thinking you would come back." Looking back now, I realize I was the David of another time. The circle of life is cruel. We hurt our parents with silence, and then, when our hair turns gray, we receive the exact same thing from our own children. I smiled slightly, a smile that was both sad and clear. Maybe fate was making me pay for the lesson I once left unfinished. I picked up the old photo of Elizabeth and David when he was 10. It was his birthday. I'd given him a small bicycle, and Elizabeth had baked a cake. The boy was running through the yard yelling, "Thanks, Dad, I'll never forget this." Thinking about it now, that phrase was just a prophecy in reverse, because you never know what you'll forget. I put the photo down, took a deep breath, and the smell of salt came in through the window. Elizabeth's voice resonated in my memory, soft as a whisper. "Michael, don't let the pain blind you. The best lesson is one that makes others look at themselves, not one that tears them down." I nodded and said to the air, "You're right, Elizabeth. I don't want to tear anyone down. I just want them to see clearly." Then I opened my leather briefcase and checked everything again. The invoices, the receipts, the payments. It was all there. Every number was proof of a forgotten love, of the silence I had paid for with my old age. I folded the papers, put them on the table, and wrote one last line in my notebook. "Tomorrow, I won't teach with words. I will teach with the truth." When I turned off the light, a ray of moonlight slipped through the window, falling on the table like a silver line. I lay down, feeling lighter. In the distant sound of the waves, I thought I heard a young David's voice saying, "I'll never forget you, Dad." I replied quietly, my eyes misty. "I won't forget you either, son. I just hope that tomorrow you remember. Just in time." Then I closed my eyes and drifted into a short sleep. Outside, the dawn was beginning to touch the surface of the sea, making way for a new day. The day of the truth. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, I opened my eyes, as wide awake as if I had never slept. There were no dreams, no images haunting me, just the strange stillness of someone who has made a final decision. I sat up, put on my shoes, the white shirt, and a light jacket. Outside, the hallway was dark. Only the safety lights cast a weak yellow glow on the walls. I took the leather briefcase, which held the 3 envelopes and the stack of documents in my name. Everything that proved this vacation was never theirs, but mine. With each step, the cold tiles echoed with a dry, firm sound, like a clock counting down. I reached the door of the staff area, where Sam was dozing by the night desk. Hearing my steps, he looked up, a little startled. "Mr. Evans, you haven't slept?" I smiled. When you're carrying something unsaid in your heart, even sleep can't rest. "Could you help me with something small?" He straightened up. His voice sounded sincere. "Of course, as long as it's not illegal." "It's not," I replied. "It's just helping an old man take a few steps without anyone noticing." He looked at me and nodded slightly. I knew in that look there was trust, something I hadn't seen in my son in years. Sam opened the door that led to the technical hallway and said quietly, "This hallway connects to the upper floors where the big suite is. Just go straight." "But are you sure?" "I'm sure. Sometimes a father has to be silent his whole life. Other times he has to make the silence speak for him." I went in, and the door closed behind me. The hallway was narrow, with grayish-white painted walls, and you could hear the sound of pipes and the smell of detergent. I walked slowly, not shaking. Every step was a reminder. "Calmly, Michael. It's not revenge. It's just the truth being put in its place." I stopped in front of the large door that led to the luxury area. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the nightlight was still on. I heard steady breathing and the soft clinking of a glass on a table. I opened the door gently, without a sound. The room was large and luxurious. On a chair, David's jacket was carelessly draped. In the bed, Jessica was sleeping soundly, still with traces of makeup on. I approached the desk, opened the briefcase, and took out the 3 envelopes. The first, for David, I placed right next to his phone. The second, for Jessica, I left on the vanity, where she looked in the mirror every morning. The last one, for Richard, I put on the liquor tray, next to the expensive bottle of wine he loved to brag about. I stood still, watching. The room smelled of perfume and wine. The light reflected on the walls in yellowish tones. I thought about the narrow room where I slept, with its smell of dampness and its old pillow. The distance between those 2 spaces was the distance of gratitude. I took the last piece of paper from my pocket, the one I had written for myself. "Tomorrow I'm not looking for justice. I'm just reclaiming my dignity." I folded it and put it next to David's envelope. Before leaving, I paused and said in silence, "I don't want you to suffer, David. I just want you to wake up." Then I turned and closed the door so gently that the wind in the hallway sounded louder. On the way back, I found Sam waiting for me, his eyes worried. "Are you finished, sir?" "I'm finished, son. You don't regret it?" I smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. When a father teaches his son, he never regrets it. He just hopes he understands the lesson. He nodded. I kept walking, without looking back. When I got to my room, I opened the door and felt incredibly light. I left the briefcase on the table, took off my shoes, and sat on the bed. In the distance, I heard the sound of the waves and the wind whistling through the palm trees, the sound of life, of things no one controls. I told myself, tomorrow they will read. And when they do, they won't just see numbers, they will see the heart of the father they forgot. Then, I turned off the light and closed my eyes. For the first time in many years, I slept deeply, the sleep of someone who knows that in the morning, the truth will speak for itself. I woke up when the sun had not yet fully risen over the sea. The air in the room felt different, so quiet I could clearly hear the distant breaking of the waves, and I had a feeling that something had just begun. I washed my face, put on a clean shirt, and made coffee in the small coffee pot in the room. The aroma of black coffee spread, warm and sharp. I sat by the window, looking out at the courtyard. The employees were already cleaning. Some early rising guests were down on the beach. Everything was strangely calm, that fragile calm that comes before the storm. Around 7, I heard a noise coming from the floor above, hurried footsteps, and then Jessica's shrill voice. "This is insane! It has to be a joke!" I took a sip of coffee, unhurried. Richard's voice followed, deep and full of anger. "What the hell does this mean? It can't be." I put the cup down, stood up, and went out into the hallway. The cleaning staff paused to look up as I walked slowly, step by step, toward the noise. When I arrived, the suite door was wide open. David was standing in the middle, an open envelope in his hand. His face was pale. His look was a mixture of confusion and fear. Jessica was holding a piece of paper with trembling hands, and Richard was red with anger, as if he'd been insulted. Seeing me, David turned, his voice choked. "Dad? This? Did you do this?" I stopped in the doorway and answered calmly. "I didn't do anything wrong, son. I just left behind some truths that someone had forgotten." Jessica threw the envelope on the table, her voice full of rage. "What truths? That you paid for everything? That we're living on your pity?" I looked at her. My eyes showed no anger, just tiredness. "No, it wasn't. It's to remind you that every meal, every night here, was bought with love, not with pity." The air grew thick. Richard stepped forward, his voice arrogant. "You had no right to do this. You've embarrassed the whole family." I tilted my head slightly and replied slowly. "I haven't embarrassed anyone. I just pulled back the curtain so you could see who was naked." That sentence plunged the room into silence. David lowered his head, clutching the envelope in both hands. I saw a faint light in his eyes, no longer arrogance, but shame. Part of me wanted to go over and hug him, but another part knew that if I did, this lesson would vanish like sea foam. Just then, Robert appeared. He walked in with his usual calm, holding a folder. "Excuse the interruption, but we need to clear up some administrative matters." Jessica spun around, her voice trembling. "What administrative matters?" Robert opened the folder and said in a monotone voice, "According to the reservation, all costs for this stay, lodging, services, meals, are in the name of Mr. Michael Evans and were paid in advance. And this morning, per his legal request, all additional charges will be transferred to the appropriate party." He paused and looked at them. "That is, to your suite's account. The provisional total so far is $18,000. Jessica's face went white. Richard opened his mouth but couldn't speak, and David was staring at the floor. I said slowly, "It's not a punishment, son. It's just the bill for ingratitude." One moment. I turned to Robert and said quietly, "Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to step out for a moment. I don't need anyone to accompany me." He nodded. I walked out of the room, leaving behind the murmur of a beginning argument, Jessica's choked voice, Richard's complaints, and David's silence. As I walked down the hall, a few tourists turned to look, not understanding what was happening. I walked slowly, step by step, like someone who has been freed from a great weight. When I reached the restaurant, I chose a table by the window with a direct view of the sea. A waiter brought me coffee. I thanked him and sat in silence. Outside, the sun had just risen over the water, radiant and cold. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own shadow, small but standing tall. I knew that, in that moment, there was nothing more to say. I had taught the first lesson. That respect can't be borrowed. It can only be paid for. I left the restaurant when the sun was already high. Its dazzling light reflected off the sea. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and the endless sound of the waves. I walked down the long hallway that led to the terrace. Behind me, I heard hurried footsteps, the familiar sound of shoes. David was running after me. "Dad!" he yelled. Out of breath, he stopped, and I turned around. There he was, his face pale, sweat on his forehead. In his hand, he still held the unfolded letter. His eyes, for the first time in years, held no arrogance, just confusion and shame. "Dad, Why did you have to do this? Why didn't you just tell me? He asked, his voice choked. I looked at him with no anger, no reproach, with the same calm you'd use to talk about the weather. Because there are some things you only understand when you're forced to face your own shame, son. The wind blew hard, carrying the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. We were face to face in the middle of the sunny terrace. I saw our shadows projected on the ground, like two parallel lines that had finally crossed. You wanted me to be ashamed? David said quietly. No, I shook my head. I just wanted you to look in the mirror without hiding. Do you know what saddened me the most? It wasn't being sent to the staff room. It was that when I looked in your eyes, I no longer saw the boy who thought his father was the strongest man in the world. David lowered his head. His shoulders were shaking. I just wanted you to be proud of me. I tried to do everything I could so the family would have status, so Jessica would respect me. Respect? I interrupted him, my voice soft but firm. You're wrong, David. People don't respect someone who forgets their roots. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to live in a way that when you look back, you see that you haven't betrayed what your parents taught you. I moved closer and put my hand on his shoulder. Do you know what I understood when I saw you laughing with Richard? I realized I had raised a man who was so afraid of weakness that he didn't dare say, I'm sorry. I taught you to be strong, but I forgot to teach you when you should bow your head. He was silent for a long time. The wind tousled his hair. Finally, he said quietly, almost in a whisper, Dad, I don't know what to say. I just feel so ashamed. I looked out at the sea. The sun was right in my eyes, forcing me to squint. It's okay, son. Shame is the beginning of honesty. Don't be afraid of that feeling. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you more human. Behind us, Jessica appeared, holding Chloe's hand. Her face was still tense, but her gaze wasn't as hard. Little Chloe tugged on her mother's hand and whispered something. Jessica hesitated, then lowered her head. Mr. Evans, I was wrong not to understand. I nodded. It's all right, Jessica. People only understand the value of a home when they're about to lose it. Richard kept his distance, in silence. He just inclined his head in a small nod. Maybe he had understood too. I turned back to David. Today, I'm not angry. I'm leaving tomorrow. But before I go, I want you to remember one thing. Love is never an obligation. It's a choice. And when you choose to love, you have to know how to respect. He nodded. Tears were falling. I saw in his eyes the little boy from long ago, the one who ran in the rain yelling, Dad, I'm scared of the thunder. I said quietly, Don't be afraid anymore, David. I'm still here. I'm just not sitting at the same table anymore. The wind blew harder, carrying away the smell of salt and the sound of sobs. I turned and walked slowly toward the shore. Behind me, I heard David call out softly, not knowing if he was talking to me or to himself. Thank you, Dad. I didn't turn around. I just smiled slightly. The sun was shining dazzlingly on the water. Maybe for the first time in years, the light no longer hurt my eyes. Because this time, I wasn't looking with bitterness, but with the serenity of someone who has taught the final lesson about respect. In the afternoon, I packed my suitcase. The small room still smelled like cheap soap, but this time I didn't feel suffocated. The light coming through the narrow window lit up Elizabeth's picture frame on the table. I looked at it for a long time and said quietly, See? Love sometimes has to take a detour to be heard. I put the picture frame in the suitcase and closed it carefully. In the mirror, the gray-haired man looked back at me, smiling. There was no longer any trace of defeat, no shadow of a rejected man, just the relieved smile of someone who has finally found himself. When I went out into the hallway, Robert was already waiting for me. He shook my hand with a warm look. I've arranged for a car to take you to the airport. All the paperwork is ready. I nodded. Thank you, Robert. You didn't just help me. You helped me remember that kindness still exists. He smiled. No, Mr. Evans. You're the one who reminded me that respect isn't about position, but about how we treat each other. We said no more. I crossed the lobby, the place that this morning had been the center of a storm. Now there was just soft music and the smell of coffee. David was standing near the reception. When he saw me, he walked over. His face was drawn, his gaze tired, but with no trace of pride. "Are you really leaving, Dad?" "Yes, son. Sometimes you have to leave so others can appreciate the space you filled." I don't know what to say, except, "I'm sorry." I put my hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself for forgetting who you were." Jessica was next to him, holding Chloe's hand. The little girl looked at me with her bright eyes. "Grandpa, when you get home, are you going to write me a letter?" I bent down and stroked her head. "Yes, sweetheart, I'll write to you. But promise me you'll never let anyone make you feel small for your kindness." The girl nodded. Jessica turned away, wiping away a tear. I headed for the door. I felt the sea breeze come in, bringing warmth and the taste of salt. The afternoon sun was cast on the steps, golden as honey. I walked out without looking back. It wasn't necessary anymore. Behind me, I heard David's voice call out, "Dad, thank you for still teaching me, even though I forgot how to learn." I didn't answer. I just smiled, letting the wind carry his gratitude out to sea. In my heart, there was no resentment, just the simple peace of someone who has closed an old chapter. For the first time in many years, I felt free, not because someone had given me back my freedom, but because I had reclaimed my own dignity. I left the hotel the next morning, when the sky was just beginning to turn a pale blue. Robert personally took my luggage to the car, while Sam waved goodbye from the door. I looked at them both, feeling a warm, hard-to-name emotion. Gratitude, maybe. They were two strangers, but they had treated me with the respect my own family had forgotten. The cab drove slowly down the coastal highway. The wind came in through the window, bringing the smell of salt and the cry of gulls. I leaned my head against the seat and watched the palm trees blur past the window. I suddenly realized that, for the first time since I arrived, I no longer felt any bitterness in my heart. It was all gone, as light as the waves pulling back from the shore. When I got to the airport, I paid, thanked the driver, and dragged my suitcase to the waiting area. I chose a seat by a window where I could see the ocean. I wanted to look at it one last time, the beach that had witnessed my loss, and also the place where I found myself again. I opened my phone. David's number was in my contacts. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I hit call. The phone rang several times. Finally, his voice came on, hoarse and hesitant. "Dad?" "It's me," I answered calmly. "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a long silence. I could hear the sound of waves on his end of the line, and then his breathing. "I've read your whole letter. I don't know what to do. I feel so ashamed." I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. "Shame is the beginning of maturity, David. I'm not angry with you. I just want you to understand that respect isn't something you owe me. It's a gift you owe yourself." Silence on the other end. Then I heard him say, his voice trembling, "Dad, I want to see you, to apologize." "There's no need to apologize," I interrupted him softly. "If you've understood, that's enough. When you can look at me without feeling guilt, but with real affection, then come." I heard his voice break, and then he started to cry, the sob of a grown man who had lost his heart for too long. "Dad, thank you for calling me." "No, David, thank you for listening." I ended the call. I set the phone aside and looked out at the distant sea. The morning light was reflecting on the water like 1,000 broken mirrors. I said quietly, as if to myself, "It's enough, Elizabeth. Our son has started to listen." And I knew my journey was over, not with a victory, but with forgiveness. That afternoon, before my plane had taken off, I got a text from Sam. "Mr. Evans, your son is sitting on the beach, alone. He's reread the letter several times. Now he's crying. He's not saying anything, just looking at the sea." I read that message over and over. My hands were shaking slightly. I could picture David sitting on the sand, the wind hitting his face, the crumpled envelope in his hands. That image made my heart ache, not with satisfaction, but with compassion. Compassion for a man who had taken too long to realize what was most important. I looked out the window. The sea below was a deep blue. The waves followed one after another, breaking on the shore like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I went back to a distant memory. David as a child, sitting on the riverbank, throwing stones into the water. Every time a stone hit the surface, he'd yell, "I win, Dad," and I would just smile. No one wins against anyone, son. The water always embraces the stone, no matter how hard it falls. Now, I hoped he would remember those words, because a father and son don't need to win. They just need to learn how to embrace. The announcement over the loudspeaker brought me back to the present. I took a deep breath and told myself, every true lesson needs tears to be understood. And today, he is learning. After a long flight, I got to my small apartment on the outskirts of town. The room was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. I set down my suitcase, took out the photo of Elizabeth, and put it on the table by the window where the afternoon light was coming in. See, Elizabeth? The boy is relearning what we once taught him. He'll grow through the pain. I made a coffee and drank it in slow sips. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn pink. I didn't feel alone. For the first time, the silence around me wasn't heavy. It was as soft as a breath. The phone vibrated again. Another text from Sam. "Sir, he still hasn't left the beach. The sun is about to set. He said he just wanted to stay a little longer because listening to the waves reminds him of you." I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. I texted back, "Let him stay as long as he wants. The waves will speak for me." Then, I put the phone down and looked out the window. The sunset light spread over the sea like a long trail of fire, beautiful and sad. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You finally heard your father's voice, not in words, but in the waves." And I knew that from that moment on, the broken thread between father and son had been mended with silence and tears on the shore. If this story captivated you, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box on the left side of your screen. Thanks for watching.